right now. I know it's working.
As if all the name-calling wasn't enough, now they're scaring the hell out of us. That's why I was so caught up, just knowing that that was coming. Welcome, everybody. I'm Neil Cavuto, and default, your fault, let's call the whole country off.
If Congress refuses to raise what's called the debt ceiling, America would not be able to meet all of our financial obligations for the first time in 225 years.
Never before in our history have we failed to pay our bills. But in 9 days, that possibility reaches our doorstep.
We're arriving at a point in a few days, we're not going to pay our bills.
Prioritization is default by another name.
By the way, now we're worried about spending, but I do want to get that last one straight. Just the act of prioritizing our bills is defaulting on those bills. Just the process of blowing through deadlines makes us a deadbeat?
You don't pay your bills. You're a deadbeat.
If you pay some of your bills, but not all your bills, you're in default on the bills you don't pay. Period.
But that isn't the case. Period. No. Backing up against the debt ceiling, unpretty as it is, does not mean you default. And no, going past that debt ceiling does not mean you default. And no, rearranging what bills you pay once you have blown past said debt ceiling does not mean you default. And no, again, prioritizing what bills you eventually pay to avoid default does not mean you default. Here is what makes you default: not paying interest to U.S. bondholders. That's it. Skip a payment to them, you might as well stamp a big old scarlet letter on your currency and fast. Because to the world, that is what makes you a deadbeat. That is how you lose your full faith and credit, when you can't faithfully pay your credit card bills, your interest payments to those who finance your bills. That and only that, not the circus that leads to that. Sure, you can get downgraded for that behavior, and as I've said many times, you should. But you haven't defaulted on anything yet. So make sure you don't. It is when you mix the two and equate the two and conflate the cash crisis, linking the two, as prominent Democrats have, that if you've done something that is far worse, you, for example, Mr. President, have poured gasoline on your own fire and risk blowing the entire country to smithereens. It's like shouting fire in a crowded theater, and there's no fire, at least yet. People still panic and rush out the doors, kind of like what anyone who invests in this country would do. As soon as you tell them there is smoke and there's not, they just take their money and run. It is stupid, it is wrong, it is dangerous, and it is unforgivable. It is far worse than calling the other side names. It is the equivalent of burning down the entire country because you can't win an argument. And this is what happens at the corner and Wall and Broad when you do that. Look at this. We had the Dow slide close to 160 points today on growing fears this is going to happen. The more the president talks up the possibility of a default, the more these guys worry, hey, this is out of control. Craig Smith is the chairman of Swiss America and says, I guess officially it is out of control. What do you make of this?
You know, Neil, it just amazes me. You just laid it out perfectly. We are not going to default on the debt. Having to prioritize bills does not mean you are going to default on a debt. And I got to tell you, Neil, I know a lot of business guys that couldn't get loans at certain times, and it was the best thing that ever happened because it made them look at what they had to do to get their businesses back in order. And here's what's interesting. 2011, Neil, we had this same rhetoric, this same exact rhetoric. And now the president is taking credit for the deficit going down faster than it ever has in the last 60 years as a direct result of the Republicans holding the line against him in 2011.
Craig, all I want to make sure, I hope people hearing us saying we're not embracing this soap opera that's going on or this tit for tat and the childish of it. What we are saying, though, is you better be very careful what you are using to define a default and equating this soap opera with a default or pushing up against a debt ceiling with a default. It is sloppy. It warrants a credit downgrade. As I said a couple of years ago when S&P downgraded us for this, they were perfectly within their rights to do that. I think they're perfectly within their rights to do so again because of this ongoing circus. But that, getting your credit downgraded, is very different than defaulting on an obligation like interest to bondholders. The president's quite right to point out, as he did, that there are many other obligations the U.S. faces, such as payments to Social Security recipients, Medicare recipients, our soldiers. All of that is fair game. All I'm saying is the technical definition of a default is when you don't make good on those interest payments. Then it's Katie bar the door. And equating the two, conflating the two, risks making a larger fire out of one where there's even no smoke yet.
You're absolutely right. And think about it. Ray McDaniels from S&P came out and literally said the same thing today, Neil. He basically said, look, the American people have been through this before. It's time to be calm. And yet the president, as you said, throws fuel on the fire. He uses words like hostage, extortion, extremist, radical. He's talking about an economy that would be thrown off the cliff. It's not going to happen, Neil. And what we need to do is exactly what we're doing. We are finally, for the first time, not playing politics when it comes to spending money in Washington, D.C. And I watched the whole president's speech. Neil, I wanted to grab that television set like the guy in that movie Network and throw it out the window, because Mr. Obama is, how can I say this politely? He's not telling the truth, Neil.
Well, I think what you risk when you're any of these leaders, the Democrat or Republican, when you have this kind of power, you risk throwing gasoline on something you probably don't want to throw gasoline on. And I think when Gene Sperling, a key economic advisor, equates earlier in the day this idea of prioritizing your expenses, just that act is the equivalent of a default. I think that was the gist of what he said. You are really scaring the markets here, and you're scaring impressionable people into thinking, well, if push comes to shove, if we're at that point, we are in default. It is not pretty, it's not right, but you are telling the markets that is the case, and the markets are interpreting from that you are throwing your hands up and saying, default, here we come.
Yeah, and look at what Jack Lew did over the weekend, the same exact thing. This president should be out calming the markets. He should be reassuring the markets. He should be explaining we are not going to default on the debt. We may have to reprioritize things, just like your opening said, but we are not going to default on our debt. And this is the first time I can think of in my 59 years I've been on Earth, Neil, that I've ever seen a president try and stir the pot, throw gas on the fire, as you put it, versus trying to put the fire out and allay everybody's fears. We're the biggest, strongest, greatest economy in the world, and we're going to get through this just like we have every other time. But this president has proven that this may work in community organizing, but it does not work in running legislatively the greatest nation on the face of the earth. And until he comes to grips with that, Neil, you're going to hear more of this rhetoric. When I hear this extortion and hostage, and do you know how the markets are equating that? They're looking at this president and saying, my gosh, I've never heard anything like this in the history of this country.
Well, I think it is sending a signal to them that right now a crisis they thought would pass maybe won't pass, or at least both sides are so entrenched it's going to be hard to pass anytime soon. And they're also equating that if it does pass, it is the equivalent of a default happening right now, which, of course, even the markets know is not the case, but that is sending the impression to those who invest in our debt that it is, and that's when it starts getting creepy. Thank you, my friend.
Well, the thing that got me the most, Neil, was when he talked about if the Supreme Court brought up the whole idea of whether our bonds would be good or not. Where is this man's thinking coming from? You don't even inference something like that to the world, no less make it part of your speech. It was crazy, Neil.
Think it, don't say it. All right, in the meantime, negotiations now. Well, the president says for